coming, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I will be talking about Inuit suicide and suicide prevention, primarily, because that's been the focus of most of my work up in the Arctic. As was mentioned, my research is actually participatory. It's called community-based participatory action research, actually. And by participatory, that means that the Inuit were my co-researchers. They helped design the studies. They helped put together interview questions. They helped interview people with me. They helped interpret the results. They helped disseminate. They co-authored papers in journals, and they disseminate the results in their own community. So that's how I've been doing all my research with them. It's been participatory. It's been a lot of fun doing it that way, actually. It takes a lot longer. But anyway, let's go here. Okay. The Inuit in Canada live in 4 regions. Inuvialuit, Nunavut, Nunavik, which is the northern third of Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador, Nunatsiavut. They've been there for almost 1,000 years. And this is Nunavut, the one in the middle, which became a political territory in 1999. So the Inuit have their own government. They're running their own show since 1999. Pretty amazing. And the government is bilingual, English and their language of Inuktitut. Here's a picture of Igloolik, which actually, Igloolik is it's a little island right up here. And this is where I've been doing most of my research. And I even lived there for a year while I was doing my McGill dissertation in anthro. Here's a photograph of the community. There are about 1,500 people who live there. Here's another photo of Igloolik. Snow is on the ground for about 10 months of the year. And there are no trees up there. It's so far north. It's above the Arctic Circle. So in the winter, there's no sun. Some more photos. Some dogs. This is my friend Lori Idlout. She was my main co-researcher, and she's a good friend. She just finished law school, actually, at the University of Ottawa. She's going to be a lawyer. And that's her with some other friends. This is Zach Kunuk, another friend of mine. He's the director of the film company called Isuma, which is right in Igloolik. And he made this film that won all sorts of awards around the world. It was Canada's Oscar nomination in 2002 for Best Foreign Language, foreign language film. It's called The Fast Runner. The Fast Runner. Has anybody seen it or heard of it? Yeah. It's an amazing film, actually. It's worth seeing. This is a sled that they go hunting with. It's pulled by snowmobiles. Sometimes it's pulled by dogs. And they go seal hunting, mostly. Sometimes for caribou. This was my house that I lived in. There's a girl in a parka. Now, women carry their babies in what's called an amauti, which is the woman's parka. They carry babies in the hood. Here's another photo. There's another friend of mine with her baby. She was the star in another film that Zach made. And he was the star in The Fast Runner. He's a good friend of mine, Natal Ungalak. I'm going to talk about him later because he and I helped do this action research with youth in the community. And there's Lori with Natal. This is my research team. I was the only non-Inuit person up there on my research team. Okay. Here's my research team again. There's some dogs with a sled. Here's, again, the dogs are pulling the sled. Another cool parka. Another parka. This guy was dressed for a film that they were making while I was up there. That's actually made out of feathers, that coat. So I had to take a picture of him. This was also in the film. That was made for her. And this is a parka. This is Sean Kidd, who you mentioned as a co-author. He was my PhD student. He came to visit me up there while I was living there. We're in an igloo, a snow house. Here are igloos, and you can see they're sort of attached to each other. This is a cairn or an Inukshuk. They've been there for centuries up in the Arctic, and they have different purposes. For example, they might say that this is where caribou run. So if you hang out here, sometimes they'll have like a hole in the center, and if you look through the hole, you're looking north. So it becomes a compass. You know where north, south, east, and west is. There's another one. There's me and Nadal. This is an old living quarters that's probably 500 years old, where Inuit used to live. That's what I looked like when I lived there. Here's a polar bear skin against someone's house. Okay, now, up until the late 1960s, Inuit lived as they had for the last 1,000 years, on family camps out on the land. And they lived in skin tents like this, sod houses, or igloos or snow houses, up until the 60s, in the late 60s. The white people who were there first were whalers, Scottish and American whalers from about 1870 to 1920. They had some effect on Inuit, not a huge amount, but they brought disease and they killed a lot of Inuit. And then there was the Trinity from about 1920 to 1945. The Hudson Bay Fur Company, missionaries, and police. Now they did affect the Inuit quite significantly. The missionaries converted them all to Christianity. And they worked with the police to actually stop some things that they didn't like polygamy and their sexual practices, which was that you had a partner with whom you had kids, but then what you did was you exchanged spouses or partners with friends and just for sex. And it wasn't behind anyone's back. It was up front, and this was done from Alaska all the way to Greenland. It was very, very common. Now the RCMP and the missionaries did not like that, so they stopped that. And this was from the 1930s, but as you can see, it's in pretty good shape because everything's freeze-dried. Everything's cold, right? Here's the cemetery in Igloolik, and a lot of these graves are suicides. Here are the suicides in Nunavut up until 2013. They started going up in the mid-1980s, and they keep going up. 2013 was the worst year. Since 2013, it's come down a little bit. And here's suicide by age. Age 13 all the way to 61. It's teenagers. Old people do not kill themselves. It's all young people, teenagers. And here are suicide rates per 100,000. For Nunavut versus the rest of Canada, males versus females, it's 10 times higher. Now the population with the highest suicide rate here in the US is Native Americans. Their rate is about 3 times higher than the national rate. Here it's 10 times higher. It's an epidemic. Okay? And these are the 26 communities in Nunavut. I worked in this community. They have, look, per 100,000, they have like over 300 per 100,000. Versus some communities that have no suicides at all. And this is the same situation for reservations here in the US. Some reservations have no suicides, some have a ton of suicides. And this is from the CDC. These are suicides across the age span. These are white people. And this is mostly white males. Goes up. Older white males have the second highest suicide rate in the US. The highest suicide rate is this. This is Native Americans. Look, the age. Early 20s, they have the highest suicide rate. So it's just as bad here. It's just not as extensive as up in the north. Now this is Ottawa. This is the Parliament building. This is where the Government of Canada is, in Ottawa. What happened was, starting in 1957, the Canadian government decided to take over Inuit lives. They said, the Inuit need some help. Because, sometimes the caribou would not come and people would be starving. So we have to make them Canadian citizens, we have to help them out, whatever. So they decided to move them all off their family camps into what they called settlements. They could have called them reservations, but they didn't. They were settlements. Crowded settlements. Those are the 26 communities that you saw. there. They're now called communities. But they were created by the government. They forced the Inuit into these settlements. All these families that some of the families didn't even like each other, and they had to live together. They took their children away, sent them to boarding, residential, or day schools, which in Australia they called the stolen generation. So this was another stolen generation by the government. And those kids at these schools were not allowed to speak their native language. They were not allowed to practice any cultural activities whatsoever. They were not even allowed to eat what they call country food, the food that they catch in the wild, okay? Because the schools thought that was unhealthy, which is ridiculous. It's actually super healthy, their country food. They started a wage economy, and with no jobs, guess what they created? Poverty. Right now, 50% of the people, the adults in Igloolik are unemployed. So there's not a lot of money up there. And it's also very expensive in the Arctic. So the Canadian government did a lot of nasty things. Okay? And these kids, when they finished those schools and were in their 20s, they started abusing alcohol. They got into domestic violence. The men started punching women, okay, their girlfriends or wives. So that was problematic. When they got older and they had kids, those kids witnessed this domestic violence as they were growing up. And then in the 1980s, they started killing themselves. So that's the third generation. Every generation since this government colonialism has gotten a little worse. So colonialism, in this case, in every case, is intergenerational. Among Native Americans, that's called historical trauma. That's a well-known word among Native Americans. So here's the social change that happened because of the government. The Inuit generally lost control over their lives. Youth cultures emerged because suddenly there were a lot of children growing up together. That had never happened before. So all the kids were kind of hanging out together, not listening to their parents, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Matchbox houses, the government brought up these houses, and they were really small. They could only fit the nuclear family. Well, prior to that, the Inuit had lived with grandparents, uncle and aunt, whatever. A lot of people lived in the same place, but now the families were separated. Grandparents had their own house, matchbox house. Decreased consumption of country foods because there was less hunting. And there was a lot of gender role change, especially for men, was significant. And this happens with colonialism around the world. It affects men much worse than women, because the women are able to maintain their roles as taking care of the house, raising the kids, etc. But the men, their roles change. The word for man and the word for hunter in Inuktitut is almost the same word. It's derived from the same root. And so if you're not a hunter, you're not a man. Okay? The biggest negative change that I found in all my years of research with the Inuit, and this is probably true for all indigenous peoples everywhere around the world, I will bet, is that this government imperialism actually wasn't even colonialism. Imperialism is when you change a culture but you don't move in. Colonialism is you move in. The white people didn't move in, they just took over. That's called imperialism. Anyway, the most negative change has been on the relationships Inuit have with each other, especially within the family. Because what happened when they sent these kids to these schools is that they come back after 9 months, and at the schools, the kids were taught that their people were savages. They now need to become white, civilized, etc., etc. So the kids would go home in the summer, and they'd look at their parents, and they're like, you guys are savages. And the parents would look at their kids going like, you don't belong here anymore. They often treated their kids like orphans. And so what's happened more up until today is that this is a family-based culture, okay? Family has been at the center of everything. Social organization, everything. It was all centered around the family. And across generations. Kids learn from their parents and their grandparents. Those were their teachers. The kids spend a lot of time, all their time, with adults because they were learning. But after this colonialism, the generations are split apart. There's what's called intergenerational segregation, in that the kids are not talking to their parents. The kids are completely not even relating to their grandparents who lived traditionally on the land. The kids were all born in hospitals in the South. And so this breaking up across the generations is very significant. When you sort of affect the family in such a negative way in a family-based culture, everything will go wrong. And to me, that underlies all of their social problems, from domestic violence to sexual abuse of children, which is common up there, to suicide, to everything. It's based, it's the main cause, I think, is this relational problem that they have with each other and across generations and families. So even back in the 60s, David Damas, an anthropologist, was studying the Inuit up there, even in Igloolik, and he found that they weren't cooperating with each other as much now that they were in these settlements. Okay, I talked about gender roles. Arranged marriage was common. The marriage was arranged when the kid was born, basically, by the parents with another family. The kids would be matched. And the missionaries were starting to tell the kids, the young people, I should say, in the 60s and 70s, stop listening to your parents. Choose your own partners. So they started doing that. And arranged marriage has pretty much disappeared completely in the 1990s. Some Inuits still do it, but very, very, very few. And believe it or not, the ones who do it, those kids whose marriages are arranged, they're actually doing better in life, in school, in work, whatever. They're actually better off because they're living more culturally. David Damas studied Nalaktuk and Ungayuk, which are the core relationship features of Inuit. Nalaktuk is respect. And it's usually respect for somebody who's older than you. Ungayuk is affection, love. And the two worked very closely together. Nalaktuk and Ungayuk. But they were split apart because of this colonialism. Teachers took over from parents in terms of the schools. They were white teachers. There's a lot of turnover among teachers even today. They're all white. They have nothing to do with the community. They know next to nothing about the culture. So the schools and the Inuit are really in different planets, even today. Here's an Inuit family I made friends with, just to show you. And I'll tell you about our first study. It was called Untitled, which means the storytellers in their language. And that started in 1994. Actually, at a conference I was at. That was my first time up there. It was at a suicide prevention conference, and I was asked to chair a panel on research on suicide. And the other panelists were all Inuit, and most of the audience was Inuit. And so what we decided to do was just ask the audience what they think we need to do to understand suicide and to prevent it. So a lot of people got up and they were giving suggestions. I was taking a lot of notes. And then we asked them, how would we go about getting this information? And they said, we need to collaborate. We need to have youth. We need to have elders. We need to have middle-aged people. We need to have researchers from the South, white researchers who have done research up here, who know what they're doing. And we all need to work together right from the beginning. So that was my first lesson on participatory research. I'd never heard of it before. There's a huge literature on it now here. But so this is actually an indigenous way of doing research. Participating. So our first study, and we used the questions for this study from the questions that were raised in the audience at that conference. So we, an Inuit woman organized a steering committee of elders, youth, and other Inuit. And I went south and organized a research team across different universities, across disciplines, of people who had done research in the north. And we worked together with the steering committee for several years, developing this project. We applied for a federal grant. We got it. So in 1998, I went up north for this first study here. And what we did was we asked Inuit in two communities. We interviewed 100 Inuit in two different communities over a period of 3 months in the winter. We asked them about What makes you happy? What makes you sad? What makes you healthy? And tell us about suicide. So the two communities we originally picked, one of them was Qallunaat, the one that with the highest suicide rate, and the other one was Inuit, which had almost no suicides at all. It had one suicide in the last 10 years. So we wanted to compare a high risk to a low risk community. But 4 years later, by the time the project started, they kind of changed places. They had not been any suicides for 5 years in Qallunaat, and Inuit had a whole lot of suicides. So forget the comparison. But the Inuit steering committee people told me, you know that community where the suicides stopped? They did something themselves. When you're there, find out what they did so we can share that with other communities. So I did. And I'll tell you about that in a second. But first of all, I just want to go back to what did we find in terms of happiness and sadness? We found family, by far, was the #1 reason people were happy. It was all about family. And so in spite of all these changes that have happened to the family, it's still #1 in people's lives. Family is the most important thing in their lives. It makes them the happiest. Everything's great as far as the family goes. The second factor was talking communication, which also overlapped with the family. So talking to each other also made them happy. And the third thing that made them happy was traditional cultural values and practices, what they call kaimaitukangit, which is basically traditional knowledge. So those three things were what were factors for well-being or happiness or mental health. Unhappiness was the absence of these things. In family and suicide prevention, we interviewed a lot of young people who had made suicide attempts, and we asked them, why are you still alive? What kept you alive? You know what the answer was? My family. I talked to my father, I talked to my grandmother, I talked to my aunt, I talked to my sister. That's why I'm alive. They helped me. So the family was the #1 reason for suicide prevention. Oh yeah, what that community did to stop the suicides. I talked to the deputy mayor, and he's the one who actually was one of the organizers of what went on there. They had this little gymnasium in the basement of their hamlet council, which is where their local government is. And that basement is the only big room in the entire community where a lot of people can get together. So they were bringing everybody from the community together to talk about suicide prevention every couple of weeks. Everybody would come together, and they would talk about things like, oh, well, what can we do for each other? How can we help each other? How can we make sure that nobody's sad? If somebody looks sad, let's reach out and help them, you know, things like that. The second thing the community did was they had a housing committee, Inuit housing committee. No houses were public up there. I mean private. All houses were public. So what the housing committee did was they removed the #1 suicide method from every house. You know what the #1 method is? The closet rod. They hang themselves in the closet at night when the family is asleep, facing the wall on the left side. That's their script. You know what our script is here in the US? Bang. Every country has a different script. In some countries, people jump off buildings. Some countries, they drown themselves, you know, whatever. So suicide is very scripted. Okay? I have another book I just finished on suicide as contagion. Suicide's very contagious. So, anyway, so the suicide stopped for about 5 years because they did that. So it's amazing. I'll tell you a story about another community. This is Igloolik again. During recess, the kids are outside. This is Qallunaat, the high suicide community in the mountains on the east coast of Baffin Island. And this has been the philosophy in all of our studies. I've done multiple studies with the Inuit up there. Nunalingni sila tuningit, which in their language means community wisdom. The experts are already in the community. I'm not an expert. They're the experts on their own lives. That's the stuff that we need to learn about. What the people know. The community's point of view. That's essentially what our research has been about. The community's point of view. Now for the good news. I told you one piece of good news, what that one community did. Well, other communities are doing similar things. And they're lowering the suicides in their communities. In one community, they started a sports team. I think it was a racquetball. And they started winning racquetball games when they were competing with other communities. And the whole community and all the young people were totally into this racquetball team. And because of that, the suicides went way down. Just because the youth had something to do. It's linked to a larger indigenous youth social movement. There's a thing called indigenism, which is basically a word for the human rights of indigenous peoples around the world. Indigenism is happening today. Indigenous peoples are getting their land back, like Nunavut, which is, I think, one of the biggest land claims in the world. They never signed any treaties, by the way. That's where they got their land. Because nobody wanted that land up there. It's the last colonial frontier, the Arctic, right? Nobody wanted it, so they left it alone. So youth-driven action with community support is what's been happening up there, and I'll tell you a story about Igloolik. Back in 1998, during the first study, I worked very closely with what they called the youth committee. A lot of communities had youth committees where young people organized themselves to do something good for young people in their community. So the youth committee in Igloolik and the youth committee in Kikikdaujuak, we worked very closely with them. They helped put our questions together for the interviews, so they were very involved in the study. Well, when we left, the youth committee decided they're going to reorganize themselves for suicide prevention. They decided what they want to do is open a youth center. So they got the film company, Isuma, Zach Kunuk's film company, to help them get some money. They got a grant, federal grant, to open a youth center. So they opened this youth center. 2 years later, there were no suicides. The community actually celebrated no suicides because the youth center was open. A lot of kids were there. They had a pool table, a lot of games, a big screen for movie night. They invited elders to come in and teach the young people their language and other cultural things about their culture. So it was a very active, and they also put together peer counseling. So the Inuit, they were trained by the social workers in their social services agency, and they were counseling each other. Inuit youth were counseling Inuit youth. So that's another thing that they did, the committee did, the youth committee. I moved there in 2004 to live there for a year to do my dissertation. This is the second generation of youth committee, because the other one grew older and they weren't youth anymore. And I was working very closely with them. In fact, they were meeting in my house every week. They had a meeting once a week on Friday, and they had nowhere to meet. So I said, come to my place. I made hot chocolate for them, whatever. So they were meeting with me, and they were speaking both in English and Inuktitut. So I was learning Inuktitut through them too. And their main goal was to reopen the youth center because it had closed after 2 years. In 1998, when they opened it, it closed 2 years later because they ran out of money. Because the youth were in charge. The youth were handling the finances. They didn't know what they were doing. The president was 17 years old. So, they didn't know what they were doing. They lost their money. They had to close the youth center. The suicides came back in a huge way for the next 8 years. Until I moved there in 2004, and then I was working with these guys. Now, they wanted to reopen the center, stop the suicides again. So, what I did with Natav, the actor who I showed you, who acted in that movie, he and I got all the youth in the community together. We organized the youth to come together to talk about what they want to see in this youth center once it opens up again. And I discovered that there were grants that they could get, federal and territorial grants, that they could get, especially if it had something to do with their culture. So when we met with all these youth in the community, I told them, I said, we can get money if what you want in the youth center has something to do with your culture. Do you guys want that? And they all said, yes, 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 because they love their culture. They love anything to do with their culture. So they came up with 26 ideas at that meeting. So then after that, I worked with these guys, and we organized those 26 ideas into 3 themes, and we applied for grants based on these 3 themes. They got all the grants. They reopened the youth center. Here's the youth center on the day of the opening. The youth committee, these guys are up here throwing candies down to the children below. The whole community was there. It was a big celebration, the reopening of the youth center. And they had the same things as the youth center had before, you know, a pool table, games, the TV. They invited elders to participate. It was always full of youth every evening. It was open in the evenings and on weekends. And the youth ran it. They were there. They were supervising it. So they were running their own show. Okay? But in the grant, one of the grants was for money for an adult director of the youth center. So they hired this woman who was an adult, who loved youth, and she directed it. So, and she was in charge of the finances. So the youth didn't have to deal with that anymore. So that was good. 8 years after they reopened the youth center, compared to the 8 years before that, suicides came down 68%. Very significant. It made a huge difference. And it wasn't just youth that were in the center, because that was a small center. The number of youth in that community is huge. They couldn't all fit into there. So, but the fact that the youth actually opened the center gave youth kind of it empowered the youth. Because the agencies like the police, the schools, the mayor's office, they were all saying the youth are doing such a good thing. So all the youth in the community were feeling better because the adults were going, youth are great, youth are great. They're doing a really good thing. So, so it was like a trickle effect. I don't really know how this center actually prevented suicides, but it did. And I think it was a trickle effect, like some good sense of well-being trickled out across the youth in that community. Maybe a sense of pride, another sense of empowerment, whatever it was working. They have posters here. Stay alive, suicide is not the Inuit way. There was another poster, I didn't take a photograph of it, unfortunately, but it said something like, don't kill yourself, suicide is a white thing. Which it is. It's not an Inuit thing. They didn't young Inuit never killed themselves in the past. They never did that. Here's another poster about the importance of culture. Now culture is really important for Indigenous people's mental health around the world. Knowing your culture, being part of your culture. So here, Inuit values and beliefs help us every step of the way through life. Know them. So they're pushing Inuit culture. Now, these youth centers are part of a bigger indigenism, a bigger part of Indigenous peoples reclaiming control over their lives, which has been lost. Okay? Suicide is being indigenized. These are Indigenous peoples doing their own suicide prevention. In the 1990s, the Canadian government actually tried to do suicide prevention, evidence-based practices. They don't work with minorities, by the way, evidence-based programs here in the US. They don't work because they're not based on the minorities. They're based on white people. So when Indigenous peoples are actually in control of their lives, things get better. And it doesn't matter what they're doing. Okay? Suicide prevention is happening in all 4 of these regions of Canada that I showed you at the beginning. In the west, in Nunavut, they have developed youth centers and other sort of youth projects. In Nunavut, there's actually Laurie, my friend Laurie was the executive director of it, Embrace Life Council. It's an Inuit organization for suicide prevention. And one of the things they're doing is they get people from communities on a conference call to talk to each other and to share with each other the good things that they're doing in their communities so that they can share and other communities can follow. Okay? In Quebec, they've put together many youth programs, including their Sapotite Youth Association. What the youth did in Nunavut, northern Quebec, is because most of the communities are on the water, almost all the communities are on the water. With kayaks, which were invented by Inuit, they paddled to different communities and put on workshops for other youth on suicide prevention. So it's very cool. And they have a rising youth council in Labrador, Nunavut. So the youth are kind of taking action across the whole north. And here's something that we're actually very proud of. And being in social work, and I'm not a social worker, but social workers like to change policy. So do community psychologists, which I am one of. Well, Lori Idlout and I were meeting with the people in Health Canada with the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch, which is the same as the Indian Health Service here in the States. We were meeting with them, and they knew that what they had done didn't work for suicide prevention. They knew it. So we were telling them about these communities and what they were doing and how suicides were coming down. And they were listening. They were very interested. And based on our research and research by another psychologist out in British Columbia, Michael Chandler, who did a quantitative study, but he found the same things we did. When Native communities are in control of their communities, police, health, cultural centers, whatever, the more control the community has over its community, the lower the suicide rates. So between his research and our research, they developed a new policy for Indigenous suicide prevention in Canada. It's called the National Aboriginal Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy. Actually, it started later than 2005. But what they're doing now is they're asking Indigenous communities to apply for grants to develop their own suicide prevention programs and activities and run it themselves. They're giving money to Native communities to run their own suicide prevention, whatever they do. And every community that has put together a suicide prevention program through this and up in the north, every community has done something different. There's no prescription. There's no evidence-based suicide prevention practice, okay? The only thing that they all have in common is that they are in control. And to me, that is the most important factor in suicide prevention, is that these Native people are in control of their own suicide prevention programs. Because when they do it, when the community is in control, it works. So isn't that amazing? This is the colonizer. They're doing something really well. So I've got to bring this now to the States and meet with the Indian Health Service and go, hey, look what Canada's doing. Do you guys have something else, something like that in mind maybe? Because they're still on reservations here in the States. They have like 12-step programs. They have all these Western programs that the Native people don't even use much on the reservations. The Native people, researchers found out, the Native people actually don't even like them. They would rather do their own healing ceremonies. I call this a traffic jam in Igloolik. This is a man with his children with a dog team. The Return of the Sun, that's the name of my book, which I just finally submitted. The publisher has it. Oxford. Anyway, before any white people were in the north, they had a practice for when the sun came back in late January. Because the sun comes back, it's been gone for 3 months, it's dark. But it finally comes back, the sun is on the horizon. Well, when the sun appeared on the horizon for the first time, the girls would run into their igloo and tell their mothers and grandmothers, this was a woman's thing, okay, that the sun is back. Well, every igloo had a seal oil lamp or a kudlik that had many wicks on it, and that's how they cooked their food, stayed warm, etc. What the older women would do was, after the girls told them the sun's back, they would extinguish the flame, and then they would relight it symbolically, saying, okay, things are going to get better now. Hunting will be better, it'll be warmer, okay, the sun is back, let's be happy. Well, that was the Return of the Sun ceremony that they had. Well, today, Igloolik, every January, has this huge Return of the Sun festival. That's what it's called, the Return of the Sun Festival. And it's huge. And it starts with this photograph I took. This is the beginning of the festival. It's a little girl and this older woman, she died just a couple of years ago, wonderful woman, with a kudlik. And they extinguish it and they relight it. And that's the beginning of the festival. And then there's all sorts of Inuit music, like drum dancing or throat singing, which is actually amazing. Women do that. And then the Inuit politicians and other people, other Inuit, get up and they give speeches about what they're doing to bring control back to the Inuit through their own government, right? And so it's a big celebration. It's actually a lot of fun. And a lot of people from different communities come there. So it's really a crowded celebration, this Return of the Sun Festival. And we've also said that our research, that's why my book is called Return of the Sun, because we've also thought that all of our research projects were part of the Return of the Sun, the return of control to the Inuit, symbolically, the sun, right? This is a photograph I took of the Return of the Sun, because I was living there, right? I spent 2 winters there, actually. But in that long winter that I lived there, this was the second day the sun is up. So the sun was up. It probably stayed up for maybe 5 or 10 minutes and then it disappeared, you know. But there it is. It's the return of the sun. Here are the doors of the igloo. We keep going through new doors in our projects as we develop new projects, and we keep going through them. And this is a picture of the kids in the youth center. You can see they're pretty happy. They were little kids and they were teenagers in the center. And this is a friend of mine. She died last year, unfortunately, with her grandchild in her amauti. Lea Otak, that was her name. She also helped me with my research a lot. So that's my presentation. So, are there any questions or comments? Yes?
So how would you suggest, if it's even possible, to like put these solutions and apply them to maybe non-Indigenous communities that struggle with suicide, you know?
Yeah. I teach a course here at Wayne.
Okay.
It's called Action Research for social work graduate students. And in that class, every student picks a project in the community in Detroit. They have to work with an agency to develop their project together with the agency, asking the agency, the stakeholders, what their questions are. And so they develop, each of them develops their own project based on what the organization or agency wants. It's not the student's idea, it's the agency's idea. So it's participatory. And they develop, I mean, their final assignment is the writing up of a proposal. They don't actually do the research, although probably half the students are actually doing the research after the semester finishes, because they've got some amazing projects. You can do this kind of research, this participatory development, program development, you can do it with anything, any problem in the world, with any population in the world. You can do it with white people, you can do it with anybody. In fact, one of the people, she's Lebanese from Dearborn, she's doing with Lebanese, young Lebanese, Lebanese youth on suicide prevention. She's doing exactly what I did with the Inuit youth. She's doing it here in Dearborn with Lebanese young people. So that's pretty amazing. And she's in that class. So, so you can do this like with anything. And public health has gotten into this big time. And the research is starting to come out on looking at outcomes of these participatory action and program development projects. And they're finding that they're actually working really well. Often better than the evidence-based programs that other people would have done, you know. I was in the School of Public Health at the University of Arizona a few years ago, and they're doing a huge amount of this kind of participatory work with what they call their border population, which is Mexican Americans, who have a lot of health problems, like diabetes and obesity and stuff like that. But they're getting these Mexican Americans to develop their own programs and run their own programs. And they're working, you know? They're actually working.
So just like, in terms of like spreading it to the public, would you just encourage like, for people outside of a culture to like be the, I don't know, like the person to like encourage people to figure out their own solutions, or like how would we?
Well, you could be like me. I'm not from their culture. I'm an outsider. But because it was participatory, they invited me in. If it was just my own research, they would have kicked me out. Because they don't like researchers. Because researchers take away. They don't give back. So because this was their research, they were totally into it. But you can also do it within your own culture. Like that Lebanese woman with her own people in Dearborn. You know, so you can be within the culture and do this, or you can be an outsider and you can do it too. It works both ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Any questions about why these kids are killing themselves? Why do you think they're doing it?
I would imagine isolation too.
Isolation is huge.
That's why the community center, youth center, they can all be together.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
you know.
Because, you know, I interviewed those kids who were part of the youth committee. I interviewed them as to why they joined, why they're doing what they're doing. You know what they said, primarily? To give kids something to do, because there's nothing to do in this community. It's a small community. There are no real resources there. So what are the kids supposed to do? Nothing. So the youth center gives them something to do. So these kids they're bored, but they feel isolated. They're angry because they feel their parents don't love them, a lot of them. And a lot of the parents, they avoid the kids as much as the kids avoid them. The parents avoid the kids too. So there's a lot of neglect of young people up north. And so these kids, they're killing themselves because, you know, they're kind of lost. And also, the primary reason they kill themselves is when they break up with a girlfriend. It's mostly boys that do it. And why would they break up why would they kill themselves after a breakup? Maybe it's because that's the only place they're getting love. I don't know. Maybe it's because it's contagious, because I talked to one guy, the president of the youth committee back in '98. I made good friends with him, Edward. He had tried killing himself 4 times. He told me he had lost 12 of his good friends to suicide. And I asked him, I said, why did you try to kill yourself? Why? He says, I broke up with my girlfriend. I said, why would you kill yourself if you break up with your girlfriend? He says, because that's what you do here. All of my friends, that's why they kill themselves. So you break up with somebody, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Suicide. Doesn't happen here. As you break up with somebody, it's normal to break up with somebody, right? But up there, it's a great pain, and suicide comes to mind because they're copying each other. It's contagious. Right? And they even tell me that they copy each other. The kids told me. And some of the elders were saying the same things, that these kids are copying each other. That's the problem. They're just copying each other. Yeah.
So why did the parents neglect again? Because I know you said that the parents neglected the kids because they felt that the kids were, you know, with the boarding schools and all that, like they taught like savages and whatever. But like currently, why would the parents like?
Currently, well, it's just, you know, I mean, you've got 3 generations of Inuit that have lived completely different lives from each other. Okay? These kids are on their computers. Their elders don't even know what a computer is. You know? These kids are on Facebook. You know, they're hanging up, they're staying up all night with each other, just, you know, so they just avoid parents. You know, it's just become common for young people to have nothing to do with their parents or their grandparents. You know? And their parents are the ones that went to these boarding schools, who ended up with the alcohol problems or whatever. Young people, alcohol among young people is not a problem today. Hardly anybody drinks. And you know why? Because the young people actually rejected their parents' drinking. They rebelled. They said, we don't want to drink because our parents are alcoholics. And they're always fighting each other. But we don't want that. So that was pretty good that they did that. But everybody up there smokes marijuana, like everybody. Everybody. Where they get the money for it, I don't know, because it's $30 a joint. It's very expensive, and they don't have a lot of money, so, but everybody's smoking.
I'm interested in what it is, the activities in these youth centers. You said that the motivation for setting up these youth centers, so when you talk to these kids, they said, well, we want to do things within our culture, and then they set up the youth center, and from what you're saying, the things they're doing seem very Western oriented.
Well, they are Western. You can see the idea of a youth center is very Western.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something Inuit invented.
Yeah.
That came from down here.
Okay.
But because they own it, and this is true for Indigenous peoples everywhere, even especially here in the U.S., a lot of Indigenous people, they have their what they call healing ceremonies. But some of their healing ceremonies are things like psychotherapy, which is very Western. But if they own it, they call it Indigenous. You know what I mean?
I see.
Because it's ours. We're doing it. We own it. It's our youth center. We started it. So it's part of our community. It's part of our culture.
But does that help in the perpetuation of Inuit culture?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the thing about their culture, like boys going hunting with their fathers and
Yes.
uncles, that's seen as very important. But a lot of boys can't do that because their fathers don't have a snowmobile, for example. So the kids, just like the arranged marriage, the kids who are more involved, the boys, for example, who are more involved in hunting with their fathers and uncles and so on, they're doing better in school. They're doing better in life. So the more the Inuit are involved in their culture, the better off they actually are. But some Inuit are kind of removed from their culture because they don't have any money for a snowmobile to go hunting and whatever. So, and the women, you know, they buy Western clothes. The women used to sew skin clothing. That's what women did. But they don't do that anymore because they don't wear those skin clothes anymore. Like this. A woman made this for me. It's a sealskin. An Inuit woman, but they don't really wear this stuff that much anymore. Maybe in the winter, sometimes they do have caribou parkas because they're really warm. But yeah, but you know, a lot. I mean, they've pretty much become Western, and a lot of people say, even the kids say, we live in two cultures. But the problem is, they're actually in neither culture. They don't even speak English or Inuktitut as well as they should. So these kids are kind of hanging. Like I said, they're a little lost. Because of the massive amount of Western culture that's come in, and the pressure to live the Inuit way, by Inuit culture, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. And their government knows that, because the government is actually trying to blend the two cultures. That's one of the goals of their government, is to blend the two cultures together and make it work. But how does it work? You know, like my friend Zach Kunuk, he's on the web, he's making films and so on, and then in the afternoon he takes off, goes hunting seals, the traditional way. You know? So he's living both lives. And when I talk to him, he says what youth need, in fact, most Inuits say this. When I ask them, what do youth need the best for suicide prevention? They will say, the youth need to get into our culture more. They're ignoring our culture, and that's why they're doing badly. So, but it's an issue, it's a problem. You know, it's a challenge. Yeah. Yes?
So as suicide becomes more normalized, do you think how they process, like the concept of death is different? Like they're more desensitized, or like how they cope with it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's one suicidologist here in the States who has a theory of suicide, and one of the parts of his theory is that these people who kill themselves are not afraid of death anymore. I'm not sure I believe that. Because people don't kill themselves because they want to be dead. They kill themselves to stop the pain in their heads. That's actually the motivation for suicide, is not to be dead. So I'm not sure that their attitudes towards death are different because of the suicides. Because I don't think they see suicide as so much as death as just something horrible that somebody did. Because they were really upset. You know what I mean? They did it to escape their pain. That's how they see suicide, is an escape from pain, not a wanting to be dead. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you think that they would react differently? Because when you were talking about the guy who was like 12 of his friends just killed themselves, how did he take it? As opposed to if someone in this society, 12 of my friends just commit suicide, I don't know how to react to that.
Well, in this society, knowing somebody who's killed themselves increases your own chances for suicide. It's a risk. It increases your risk. Just knowing somebody. But up there, I have not met an Inuit person who has not lost somebody to suicide themselves. Either a family member or a friend. Everybody has lost somebody to suicide, like everybody. That means they're all at risk, I guess. But, you know, was that part of your question, or did I answer it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Anything else? Guess we're probably finished because it's after 1:30.
Okay.
So thank you again.
Thanks so much.
And thank you.